All right. Well, welcome everybody, all one of you. Um, Today I'm just going to do kind of a brief overview of the last bit of I mean, there's still a lot more that I could talk about with the Cold War, but we're going to talk about Vietnam today to an extent. And then we're also going to be taking a look at some of the developments that happened in the Cold War after the Cuban Missile Crisis and stuff. After that, things kind of start to cool down. It takes a while, and then they ramp back up later on. So let's start. So the Vietnam conflict really does start under Kennedy because military operations, at least for defensive purposes, start under Kennedy back in 1960-61. So throughout Kennedy's presidency, but Kennedy was very, very hesitant about getting involved in the Vietnam conflict because, I think that there's a speech that was given, or at least an interview that was given by Kennedy with CBS about a month or so, maybe 2 months before he was assassinated in November of 1963. And he gave this interview with the news, and in that interview said something to the effect of that he really thought that it was Vietnam's, role. It was Vietnam's responsibility to take ownership of fighting off communism in that nation, and the extent to which Vietnam wanted to fight off communism, the United States would help. But he stopped short of saying that the United States should become militarily involved in the Vietnam conflict. It's not until after Kennedy's assassination, 1964-65, that the United States, under the president that replaces Kennedy, the vice president turned president Johnson, became Lyndon B. Johnson, not Andrew Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson took over the presidency, and Lyndon B. Johnson was from Texas. He was this old school Red Scare sort of anti-communist dude, and he felt that it was the United States' responsibility to become far more actively involved from a military standpoint in preventing Vietnam from falling to communism. And it's during 65, 66, 67 that we really see military operations significantly increase in Vietnam for more offensive purposes rather than just defensive purposes. And some of that had started under Kennedy, I guess, but the vast majority of the expansion of the war takes place under Johnson, which could be considered a major criticism of Johnson's presidency, as the Vietnam War does not pan out very well, particularly after 1968. The tides of the war change significantly against the favor of the Vietnam War from the American standpoint, which is that while we were highly successful in killing a whole bunch of people in Vietnam, we were not successful from a strategic standpoint in preventing that nation from falling to communism. Now, today, Vietnam is still technically communist, but it's really not the same kind of communist that it was back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. It's still single-party rule. It's still not a place where probably you have a whole lot of freedom, but economically, at least, Vietnam has a whole lot of kind of oddly free market capitalism, and so it's been a long time of single-party rule since 1975, which is when the Vietnam War, or at least America's involvement in the Vietnam War, finally comes to an end. But we're going to talk about some of that today. We'll also talk about some other American developments in the war and Soviet developments in the war. But first, let's turn over to the PowerPoint so we can see what's going on here. Again, I'm not using my own PowerPoint for this, so I'm a little bit of a fish out of water using this PowerPoint, but we'll do the best that we can with it. So the road to war. So in the early 1900s, got to start back a little bit here. In the early 1900s, France gained control of most of Southeast Asia, which included Vietnam, but also Laos and Cambodia, which are now sovereign nations neighboring Vietnam. Now, by the 1930s, there had been a number of different independence movements developing there, but the most significant of these developments was led by a guy named Ho Chi Minh, who's pictured here on the right. Ho Chi Minh was a communist, and he is probably as true of a Marxist form of communist as you could find in the 20th century. And he became the leader of this Vietnamese nationalist movement. Now, even though it is a nationalist movement, we're using that in the context of a communist nation trying to create a communist sovereign Vietnam that was no longer under French rule. After World War I and ultimately after World War II, Vietnam was still a French colony going back to the age of imperialism. And so France was reluctant to try to give up the control of its global colonies. But after World War I and II, France is so devastated by both of those wars and is really not the imperial nation that it was back in the 19th century that it's going to have an increasingly difficult time retaining control over its colonies, including Vietnam. And Ho Chi Minh's nationalist communist movement in Vietnam is going to gain a whole lot of traction during the 1940s and into the 1950s. So he led a series of strikes and revolts against French colonial rule in Vietnam, and the fighting begins. Ho Chi Minh founded the Viet Minh, which was obviously partially named after him, and it was this organization that was trying to fight off the French. And the French had held most of the major cities in Vietnam, which are nowadays, like Hanoi and at the what is now known as Ho Chi Minh City, but at the time was known as Saigon and others. But the Viet Minh was extremely popular in the countryside, and being that much of Vietnam was still a highly agrarian nation and very rural and farming oriented, communism is going to especially appeal to them because, remember, communism appeals to the proletariat, which is the working class in particular. Remember, the whole symbol of communism in Russia was the sickle and the hammer, and those are tools of the working class, right? So Ho Chi Minh's communist organization really found a lot of reception amongst the Vietnamese people, which were largely farmers and stuff. As the battles escalated, people in France started to wonder if the Vietnam colony was even worth fighting for anymore, and there was a battle at a city called Dien Bien Phu, and the French were defeated at this battle at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, and the French surrender and give up their imperial control of Vietnam. Well, of course, this is instantly going to make the hairs on the back of any Western nation stand up, because once again, going back to that idea of the domino theory, the idea being that if we see Vietnam had been divided into a north and a south, very much like Korea was, except for instead of Korea, which was separated on the 38th parallel, Vietnam, after World War II, had been divided into a north and south region as well, the north being communist and the south being democratic. And the concern is that the communist takeover in Vietnam would overrun the more democratic south after the French surrendered their control after losing the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And they don't want to see communism spreading during the Cold War, especially. So Ho Chi Minh became the leader of Vietnam, and this is really where the fighting begins. Now, during the conflict, of course, the United States had supported France, but with Vietnam now free from French rule, the U.S. believed that other countries in Asia might be seeking independence as well, and maybe they could be turned to communism as well. So it would just be another domino in a long line of other dominoes in Southeast Asia, Laos, Cambodia, perhaps Thailand, and other places that could ultimately end up turning communist, and that would mean that a whole lot of Asia and in general the eastern sphere of the globe turns communist, and this would make for quite a concerning geopolitical development. So the United States increasingly takes on the position that they need to stop the spread of communism there. So Southeast Asian nations, very much like a row of dominoes. If one fell to communism, maybe others would too. And this was used to justify the U.S. foreign policy in Asia during the Cold War. Now, Vietnam is significantly divided during this time. Once France had been defeated, after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and of course this is now several years after the end of World War II. Like I said, Vietnam gets divided at the 17th parallel into a north area, and you can see here's Dien Bien Phu, all the way up here towards northern Vietnam, close to the border of China. Here's Hanoi, which was originally the capital of North Vietnam, and then Saigon all the way down here in South Vietnam, which is supposed to be allegedly pro-West and stuff. So the leader of South Vietnam was controlled by the guy on the left there, and his name I am blinking on at this very second, but it will come to me. Maybe it's even in the PowerPoint and another thing here. But, oh God, what was his name? Ho Chi Minh. His name was, let's see here, is it here? No Din Diem. That's what his name was. Okay, so No Din Diem. And I know that, sorry, it's right here. I didn't even see it. I wasn't paying attention. So here's No Din Diem, not to be confused with the city of Dien Bien Phu. I know that these are not probably super familiar names to you, but don't get them confused. No Din Diem is the anti-communist leader of the democratically controlled South Vietnam, which of course had been set up by the United States and France in the wake of losing the Battle of Dien Bien Phu to try to prevent communism from taking over the entire nation of Vietnam. So the North is controlled by Ho Chi Minh and his communist forces. The South is controlled by No Din Diem. Now, Diem really isn't super democratic because he rules the South more or less as a dictator, but he is at least supported by the West, and he is an anti-communist. And so they'd rather support a dictator in the South who is pro-West and willing to, be on America's side and the rest of Western Europe and NATO's side than to support a communist takeover. And so in the South, it's not like just magically because you draw a line across a place, you're just going to magically change people's minds who resided in the southern areas of Vietnam about Ho Chi Minh and his victory against the French. So he had an uphill battle from the start because there were so many people in rural populations in the South who did not want to see No Din Diem or a democratically controlled Vietnam in the South, or rather a Western-supported one, as it's not super democratic to begin with. So there is this anti-No Din Diem force called the Viet Cong that develops all around Vietnam, both in the North and in the South, and they really increasingly grow in popularity in the South as not freedom fighters, but as communist rebel forces who supported the leadership of Ho Chi Minh rather than No Din Diem. And in 1963, actually right before Kennedy gets assassinated, No Din Diem himself is assassinated and was replaced by more unpopular leaders in the South. And a communist takeover of the South seemed almost inevitable at that point. So this is where things get really concerning to America, because now there's no real stable government in the South to continue anti-communist, government or whatever. So the United States super nervous that the South is going to fall to communism, and over time, slowly but surely, the United States began to escalate its involvement in South Vietnam, originally by sending kind of military advisors, then eventually by sending equipment, then planes, and so on to South Vietnam. And very quickly, the role turns from advisors to fighting defensively against the rebel forces of the Viet Cong that were trying to overthrow the Diem government, and then down the line, offensive forces to actively go and try to destroy the Viet Cong and Ho Chi Minh. So America entered into the fight. President Lyndon Johnson announced that there were 2 U.S. destroyers that had been attacked in what was known as the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of Vietnam. Now, this is a very, 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 very disputable claim. Lyndon B. Johnson, it's suggested, may have made this entire thing up. Indeed, there was a ship that was attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin called the USS Maddox, Maddox. The USS Maddox, though, it's questionable whether it was actually fired upon by the Viet Cong or whether maybe there was friendly fire or maybe just an accident that happened. Who knows? But nonetheless, it's used kind of like a jumping point, the same way that Pearl Harbor was, or the same way that the sinking of the Lusitania was back in World War I. This catches news in the press, and it's used as an excuse to say, look, they're attacking our ships. We need to do something to retaliate. And this in the initial part of the war, allows Americans to feel a little bit of a vindication to get more actively involved in stopping the spread of communism in Vietnam. Now, was it actually attacked? Well, maybe. North Vietnamese boats were located in the Gulf of Tonkin, and perhaps they did attack it. And in such a case, obviously the United States would have retaliated no matter what. But nonetheless, this was definitely blown into huge proportion in the press to try to sway the hearts and minds of the American people that it was appropriate for the United States to become actively involved. So Congress under Johnson, and remember, they're still reeling from the death of the assassination of President Kennedy, and the United States in the 1960s is facing some serious social changes itself, with the civil rights movement happening at the same time at home. There's a lot of political upheaval in the United States as well as there is across the globe at this time. So people are feeling probably a little bit fearful, probably a little bit uncertain, and this too would have lended itself to the United States becoming more actively involved in Vietnam. So Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution response, which basically said that the president can send in U.S. troops to fight in Vietnam without an actual formal declaration of war on the nation of Vietnam. So this gave President Johnson significant powers as president to actively engage in military operations in Vietnam without actually declaring war, and this significantly widens the expanse of the Vietnam conflict very early after he takes over from Kennedy's presidency. So America enters into the fight. In 1965, Johnson sent over 185,000 U.S. soldiers to fight in Vietnam. By 1968, you had more than 500,000 U.S. soldiers fighting in Vietnam. So as I said, 65, 66, 67, we were really ramping up operations there, and we had the best equipped, most advanced military in the world at that time. Really, most people would have looked at this as like, boy, the United States getting involved in Vietnam, they're not going to stand a chance. Well, that is not the case. There were two main problems for the United States in fighting against the Vietnam. First of all, they were fighting against guerrilla warfare in very unfamiliar terrain. Because Vietnam is made up of Vietnamese people who are used to living in an extremely hot and hostile terrain of this dense tropical jungle that's just ridiculously humid, really thick jungle and tall grass and all sorts of different just unpredictability in terms of negotiating the terrain of that territory was a real problem for U.S. soldiers who were not at all used to fighting in that climate. Now, the Vietnamese guerrilla fighters, on the other hand, they're from Vietnam. They're used to that conflict. They're used to the terrain. Plus, remember, they're fighting to defend their territory and to fight to support their hostility. And we could really draw a very significant comparison between when the British attempted to reign in control of the American colonies during the Revolutionary War. The Americans were fighting on terrain that they were used to. The British had to bring the fight to America to retain control of it. And there were a lot of advantages for the Americans because, they were on the defensive. They're at home. They're defending their own territory. They know the territory very well. It's a huge amount of land that they're defending in the United States, obviously far greater than that of the size of Vietnam. However, in Vietnam, you have this whole other aspect of this dense jungle, and the people there are used to that. They're used to the heat, and they know the terrain really well, and that allows them to set up all sorts of different things, traps and underground tunnels and other things like that allow them to fight rather effectively against the Americans, who are really fish out of water when it comes to the climate, terrain, and topography of the country of Vietnam. And two, remember, another factor in Americans defending their freedom against the British, or fighting for their independence against the British, was, they feel morally compelled, right? They feel like this is their land, this is their home, they're defending their territory, and there's this they have a lot of heart in the battle. And the Americans, very similar to the way that the Vietnamese do in the 1960s and into the 70s, use unconventional tactics to fight against the very disciplined, highly ordered military of their invaders. So, the Americans, we were setting traps and stuff too, and it made it that the conventional army of the British, the standing militaries of the British and the Prussians, who were trying to, subdue the American rebel fighters and reclaim their colonial territories, they're just not used to fighting in situations where people are shooting from hidden places or setting traps or running up behind you or whatever else. And the Vietnamese use exactly the same darn tactics against the American soldiers in the 60s and 70s. And the Americans are just not really trained to do that kind of fighting. And when you couple that with the difficulties of the terrain, it really made it a difficult fight. Now, that's only one of the sides of the things. The other side is that the South Vietnamese is already really unpopular. So even in the South, you didn't have a whole lot of people who were super interested in preserving the Western-supported government of, by this point, Ngo Dinh Diem is dead, but the South Vietnamese government is just really, really unpopular, and the Viet Cong is just growing and growing and growing and growing in size. Also, the Viet Cong are simply farmers. They don't have military uniforms. So a person who's a farmer during the day and then picks up an AK at night and starts fighting, you can't just kill innocent civilians. That's not how war works. And it's really difficult to even tell who your enemy is in Vietnam, because during the day, they might just seem like regular folks. And then during the night, they're running operations against the American military. And meanwhile, they're doing so literally underground. I mean, we use that phrase underground sometimes metaphorically to say that it's difficult to pick up on where people are at and so on. But literally, they are fighting from underground. They are digging tunnels that connect vast territories together through the terrain. Their hideouts and stuff like that are very, very, very well hidden in the dense jungle. And the Vietnamese people increasingly are siding with the Viet Cong because of their status as farmers, but also because they support Ho Chi Minh as the stronger of the rulers. So, the Viet Cong continue to grow with support from Ho Chi Minh, and as well, remember that the Soviet Union and China also play their role in this. They support Ho Chi Minh because, from a global framework of things, Vietnam is very much being swept up into the broader scheme of the Cold War conflict between the two superpowers of the United States and the USSR. So, China and the USSR, because of their support of communism, are going to lend their aid to the North Vietnamese and, indeed, Ho Chi Minh himself. Meanwhile, the United States really isn't making any progress fighting on the ground. It's just too darn difficult. So the United States starts to turn to fighting from the air, and they engage in bombing millions and millions and millions of acres of farmland and jungle and forest to destroy the enemy hideouts. And this was where oftentimes they use different methods to do so. So Agent Orange was a pesticide, and it ended up being extremely toxic. And in fact, men who fought in Vietnam on the ground, as planes were dumping all of this massive, herbicide killing plants. It's basically plant killer. They're basically dropping Roundup, which is hugely cancerous. It was actually not Roundup, but Roundup is also cancerous, just as a side note. But anyhow, which is why you can't buy it anymore. But the point is that they're dropping all of this plant killer chemicals all over the place, and ultimately it does nerve damage and brain damage and causes birth defects and all sorts of crazy things, which they didn't know at the time. But of course, it doesn't take long before people start to develop serious health problems as a result of dropping all this. But when they weren't dropping Agent Orange, which is this chemical makeup, they were dropping napalm, which is basically gasoline. It's like a gelatinous, almost sticky substance that is made up of gasoline and other flammable chemicals that combust. And so they're literally setting Vietnam on fire to try to burn out the jungle and be able to see the ground better, as well as burn down any of their hideouts. Excuse me. Now, these U.S. bombings only made the South Vietnamese government even more unpopular because they're ravaging Vietnam with all of these day and nighttime bombings. And this was a huge operation called Operation Rolling Thunder that was instigated by the United States. Now, as the Vietnam War grew increasingly unpopular in the United States, President Nixon started to withdraw troops. Now, we need to talk a little bit about what happens in 1968. There was this huge thing called the Tet Offensive in January of 1968. See, for years under Johnson, the American population had been largely in support of stopping the spread of communism. And favoring the government, but they had also been being told by the government that everything was going well, and that the United States, X amount of, they kept on saying that the United States was making so much ground, and the press kept on reporting stuff that the government was putting out to them about how well the war was going and how it should be a short war, and that Vietnam, every day there's more Viet Cong being killed, and eventually that the United States would be able to stabilize that region there. And then the Tet Offensive happens. And what the Tet Offensive was that there was this huge, very organized, well-organized strike upon multiple U.S. strongholds, particularly in South Vietnam and Saigon and other places, that resulted in the United States losing control temporarily of a lot of these strongholds. And this hits the news, and everybody's like, what the heck? I thought you said that we were winning this war. How did we just simultaneously lose control of most of our strongholds in Vietnam as a result of the Viet Cong launching this really well-organized attack? Well, that's going to be really hard for the U.S. government to explain away. And starting in 1968 and increasing throughout 69, 70, people's attitudes here at home radically change against the war, and you'll learn a lot more about that in American history next year. But Johnson Johnson was technically only a one-term president because he took over for the tail end of Kennedy's presidency in 1963 and 64. There was an election in 64. Johnson had done a good job taking over for Kennedy in that first year that he was president, from November 23rd, I guess, 1963 up until the election. And so people overwhelmingly voted for Johnson in the 1964 election. So he starts his first formal term as president in January of 1965, and he serves as president 65, 66, 67, and then in 68 there's another election. But by 68, like I said, the Tet Offensive was early in 68, and it is a downhill spiral for Johnson's presidency at the tail end. Now, Johnson does other things domestically that were really good, like the Great Society, and again, you'll learn about all that next year, the Civil Rights Movement and stuff like that. All of that very important attributes of Johnson's presidency. However, from a foreign policy-wise, the biggest issue on everybody's mind at that point is the Vietnam War. And at this point, the United States is decidedly not doing as well as they had been said that they had been doing. And so in 1968, Johnson actually doesn't even run because he knows he doesn't have a chance of being reelected in 68. So he steps down. He is a one-term president. And Richard Nixon, who had actually originally run against John F. Kennedy in 1960, comes back as the leading Republican candidate. And he runs against, I think it's Hubert Humphrey, who was the Democratic candidate. And really, Humphrey didn't stand a chance against Nixon. People were tired of the Democrats by that point, and Johnson having been a Democrat, Kennedy having been a Democrat, and they basically blamed this entire Vietnam War on the failed Democratic foreign policy. So Republicans gained the White House in 1968. Now, President Nixon also doesn't exactly go down in history as being an excellent president. He, even worse in some ways than Johnson, really. even though Nixon successfully, in his second term, he gets reelected in 1972, but ultimately has to step down, and we'll talk about why that is. But Nixon takes over the presidency in 1968, and he tries to start withdrawing troops as early as 1969. And his plan was something called Vietnamization, which was where the U.S. troops would gradually pull out as the South Vietnamese increased their own combat role and started fighting for themselves. So that was what Vietnamization was. How successful is it? Well, it's successful in the sense that troops do start to downsize, but even by the time that the 1972 election comes around, we're still actively involved in military operations to a degree. And so to get reelected, his reelection campaign very much heavily revolved around that his second term would be ending the Vietnam War altogether and completely stopping U.S. operations there. But by that point, of course, we'd already been involved in Vietnam for over a decade, and the damage had been done. So there's Richard Nixon over here. The United States does ultimately leave Vietnam in 1973. And then by 1975, the North Vietnamese had not stopped attempting to take over the entire nation and reunite Vietnam as a single nation under Ho Chi Minh and a communist government. So the fighting doesn't stop just because the Americans leave. A lot of people look at this as the Americans kind of going home with their tail between the legs. But really, ultimately, the American support for the war had fallen out so much that that there really was no hope of staying in the conflict any longer. And so the Vietnam War is often tallied as a loss for America, despite the fact that if you look at the numbers, from a tactical point of view, if you're looking at how many Vietnamese folks were killed by Americans, we're talking about 1.5 million Vietnamese Viet Cong guerrilla fighters were killed in this conflict. We're talking about a tremendous number of deaths at the hands of Americans, the American military. And if you look at the number of losses of the American military, there were about 58,000 people that died, which is far, far, far less than, say, for example, World War II, where we lost about 300,000 people. No, I'm not saying that numbers alone are what matter, because remember, even as many Vietnamese folks were killed during this conflict, for every Vietnamese soldier that was killed, 2 more would join the Viet Cong because of the anger surrounding American, interference in their nation, which was a sovereign nation. And because the American public had turned so adamantly anti-war by the end of the 1960s, American soldiers, who many of them, remember, soldiers, a lot of times the ones that are drafted and stuff, if you come from wealth, if you are, part of a billionaire family or a highly politically connected family or whatever else, there are ways of getting out of the draft. And so it's not the rich people who go and serve on the front lines, it's the poor people who serve on the front lines. And many of them didn't support the war in the first place, but people who, if you were going to college, if you were an only son, various other things, there were ways of getting out of draft. They were called draft dodgers. And this is stuff that you'll learn a lot more about in U.S. history when you'll spend an entire unit on the Vietnam War next year in 11th grade. But the American soldiers, who many of them not even having a choice to go and fight, are coming home from this conflict and really being treated very, very, very badly by the American population, who is so anti-war. And they had several reasons to be super suspicious of the government. There were various things that happened during the Vietnam War. For example, there was something called the My Lai Massacre. The My Lai Massacre was where American soldiers, for one reason or another, basically just literally massacred an entire city of people in My Lai that resulted in, the deaths of literally women and children and infants even. I mean, it was a slaughter, and it was a major, major stain on the U.S. military's reputation, and it does not help the government at all to try to continue to excuse military operations when the military themselves now have been found guilty of committing atrocities overseas. Now, is that all the people in the military? Of course not. It was a select group of people, And the military themselves is angry that they're over there. They're angry at the futility of the war. They're angry at the Vietnamese. They're angry, and this hatred that is boiling over in them is taken out on innocent civilians in Vietnam, and it's an absolute public relations nightmare for both the government and the military to explain why something like the My Lai massacre would ever happen at the hands of American soldiers who are supposed to be fighting for the good of the world, not to go over and be killing people in a barbaric fashion. So, and then there were other developments too. There was something called the Pentagon Papers that came out. The New York Times did a major secret investigative thing where high-ranking government officials were able to get information that the United States government had deliberately and intentionally misled the American population at virtually every single stage of the war, going all the way back to the Gulf of Tonkin resolutions, but then also resulting in the Tet Offensive and all the other tragedies that happened in Vietnam. So by the time that the turn of 1970 rolls around, people are absolutely furious with the government, and they have no trust left in the American government at all. And this is why Nixon is so heavily pressured by the population to end the conflict. So 58,000 Americans dead, 1.5 million Vietnamese soldiers dead. There's obviously a major discrepancy there. Afterwards, Cambodia, there's a communist revolt there as well. Remember that even the Viet Cong soldiers, the communist fighters supporting Ho Chi Minh, had even used lands in Cambodia and Laos outside of the actual territories of Vietnam that the United States wasn't supposed to be involved with, as kind of a safe haven to get away from American troops and continue their operations. And in 1975, a group of communist rebels set up an entirely brutal communist regime there called the Khmer Rouge, led by a guy named Pol Pot. And Pol Pot, this whole communist thing there was so communist. It was all about promoting agricultural rural way of life, a complete rejection of Western ideals, a complete rejection of European educations and other things like that. Anyone who had even glasses in the Khmer Rouge regime was executed for being considered too intellectual. So it was really trying to bring or restore a totally agrarian society, communist agrarian society there, by brutally killing anyone who was even perceived to be an intellectual or even perceived to be at all supportive of the West or democracy or capitalism or anything like that. So Pol Pot slaughtered 2 million people who were considered to be quote-unquote enemies of the Khmer Rouge. All right, and you can see some of these massacres here in this. Sorry about that. Okay, so in 1978, North Vietnam invaded Cambodia and actually ended up overthrowing the Khmer Rouge. And in 1993, Cambodia eventually adopted a more democratic-styled constitution. So these are all very, very recent. It wasn't until I was in third grade that Cambodia adopted a democratic constitution. So this is all relatively recent. Okay, so that more or less covers about what you would need to know pertaining to the Vietnam conflict. There are some other things about the Nixon presidency that we do need to talk about, though, with respect to the Cold War, and that is namely something called détente, D-E-T-E-N-T-E. Now, the détente period was a period of time of trying to cool down Cold War tensions. They were really trying to lessen the degree of hostility between the United States and the Soviet Union at that time. And by this point, the guy that's the leader of the Soviet Union is a guy named Brezhnev, Leonid Brezhnev, Brezhnev is how you say his name, or how you spell his name. And Leonid Brezhnev is kind of a hardliner, conservative, communist guy. The Soviet Union really does not do at all very well under Leonid Brezhnev, but he is the most stable communist leader that Russia had seen since Stalin. And he's not as brutal as Stalin, but he's not really that great either. And Leonid Brezhnev is in power from about 1960, 8 or somewhere in that neighborhood, all the way until 1982. So he's the leader of the Soviet Union for a really good long time, including throughout the Nixon years in the early 70s. Now, what happens to Nixon before he has to step down from office? Well, Nixon had signed a few things that were good to reduce, to denuclearize, to de-escalate the conflict with the Soviet Union, try and make the peril of nuclear war less likely and stuff like that. Try and, so by the time that we get to the 70s, people are not like in the 50s where they were freaked out about the space race and Sputnik and nuclear arms buildups and stuff like that. They're trying to reduce that under Nixon, and he signed something called the SALT talks, or there's something called the SALT talks, which is the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty talks. And there were two of them, SALT 1 and SALT 2. But basically the whole idea is let's reduce our nuclear arms and make it so that we're not, the whole policy of Eisenhower before Kennedy was brinkmanship. So the détente is basically the opposite of brinkmanship. It's trying to reduce Cold War tensions. And so there's that. Now, Nixon faces some problems because at home, when Nixon ran for re-election in 1972, he was going to get re-elected. The guy was just kind of a paranoid politician. He was kind of a kooky dude. And so Nixon committed an illegal act. And what he did was, during the re-election, the way that elections work, you have the Democratic Party, you have the Republican Party. Nixon was a Republican. So the way that the candidates are chosen for president is that you have these conventions. And there's a Democratic National Convention and there's a Republican National Convention. And at these national conventions, it's determined who the Democratic and the Republican nominees are going to be for the presidential candidates. And what Nixon did was there's a hotel called the Watergate Hotel, and it's in Washington, D.C. And what Nixon did was he hired people to wiretap the Watergate Hotel. Why? What was the deal with the Watergate Hotel? Well, the Watergate Hotel in 1972 was going to be the location of where the Democratic National Convention nominees were staying, and that he wiretapped the phones in the hotel where they were staying so that he could get information of what the Democratic political strategy was going to be, and so on and so forth, so that he would have an upper hand in the 1972 election. Well, of course, there was somebody who found out about this, and the New York Times, once again, just like with the Pentagon Papers that they figured out in the 70s, they did this really thorough investigative. Wait, was it? No, it was maybe it was the Washington Post. Excuse me. I think it was the Washington Post that did this. So the Washington Post, and in particular, a journalist by the name of Bob Woodward, ended up having a secret contact from Nixon's administration, the upper echelons of the Nixon administration, who had known that this wiretapping took place. And so there was this huge expose on the Nixon administration and its illegal wiretapping of the Watergate Hotel, and this is what ends up becoming known as the Watergate scandal, of course, and it's completely illegal what he did. And so he was going to be impeached and would ultimately have had to resign. Being impeached would mean that he would not be president anymore. Also, his vice presidential candidate, Spiro Agnew, was also caught up in this. And so both Nixon and his vice president, even though they were elected in 72, all of this doesn't hit the fan until after he was already elected. So in 1973, all of this hits the papers. It's a huge news story. And he, rather than going through the process of impeachment where he knew that he would have been removed from office and that there would have likely been criminal charges and everything else, he chose to resign, to step down from the presidency, which is the only time in history that a president has actually resigned the presidency absent of an impeachment. So that's what ends up happening to Nixon. He is kind of discredited, and he ultimately gets pardoned by the following president from criminal charges. And the president that replaces Nixon, it's not going to be the vice president, because the vice president had to step down too. So they go to the, oh God, what is it? Is it the Secretary of State or is it the Speaker of the House? I can never remember which one it is. There's a whole litany of like in case of emergency, who takes over as president. And so the guy who became president was a guy named Gerald Ford. Now, Gerald Ford never had any aspirations of becoming president. He really didn't want to be president. And once he takes over the presidency, he is a one-term president and doesn't even run to be reelected because he didn't want to be president in the first place. So Gerald Ford is president. Gerald Ford's viewed as clumsy. He's viewed as kind of this. It's too bad because Gerald Ford is not a bad dude. He was a good statesman, but he's president during one of the most chaotic times in American history, in the 1970s. And so after Gerald Ford's presidency, in 1978, there is and is it 1970? Let's see here. I gotta get my years right. So 72, 1976. 1976, Jimmy Carter, who is a Democrat, becomes president, replaces Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter also faces other problems because by this point there's problems with the Middle East that are going on. There's this whole oil crisis that's happening. The United States economy is in really rough shape throughout much of the 70s. And then still too, you have some of these Cold War problems that are going on. So anyhow, Carter, once again, a one-term president, and people's faith in the government is so low at this point that Carter, once again, an amazing, probably Jimmy Carter is still alive today. Jimmy Carter is an amazing humanitarian and a very, very, very good human being, a deeply religious man, and has done so much for Habitat for Humanity and stuff. As in terms of post-presidency careers, Jimmy Carter by far and away has probably one of the most successful post-presidencies of any president in American history for humanitarian efforts. And so, Jimmy Carter he's very elderly. In fact, he's the longest-lived president of all time. And but he's still, boy, I'll tell you what, he gets out there and he builds homes for folks in crises and stuff. He's an amazing human being, but not the greatest president. He was kind of considered soft. He was considered too friendly, and kind of the kindness of his character was not enough to restore the faith of the American government in light of all of the problems that are going on during Carter's presidency. So it's really not until we see Ronald Reagan elected in 1980 where people's faith starts to be restored in the American government. And Jimmy Carter, remember too, when he was president, he was one of the youngest presidents ever. He wasn't as young as Kennedy, but he was still very, very young to be president at that time. And then when Ronald Reagan gets in there, he's one of the oldest presidents to have ever served. And so Ronald Reagan was from California. You can go to the Reagan Library up in Simi Valley. It almost burned down in the fires. They were really lucky about that, actually, just not that long ago, last year maybe. Anyhow, point being that once Ronald Reagan was kind of one of these. He was a household name. People knew him. He was a Hollywood actor before he became a politician. He was governor of California for a while. And when Ronald Reagan becomes president, people start, he's kind of a John Wayne sort of a dude. If you know who John Wayne is, an old Western actor, tough guy, sort of mentality. But at the same time, Ronald Reagan was kind of the soft-spoken guy, and people's faith in the government started to be restored under Reagan, who had all of these policies. But Reagan, being a man of his generation, and that being an older generation, brings the United States back into a much more heated conflict with the Soviet Union. He really, really ramps up. This is right towards the end of Leonid Brezhnev's rule of the Soviet Union when Reagan gets elected in 1980. But Russia is in they're a mess. They're an absolute mess by the time that the 80s roll around. They're still building submarines in the early 80s based on plans from German blueprints from World War II and stuff like that. The Soviet military may be a nuclear power, but the burden of all of the economic policies of the Soviet Union and one-party rule and a command-style economy, it really drives Russia right into the ground, and they are they're really hurting by the time that Reagan comes to office. And Reagan, being this kind of old school 1950s Red Scare sort of a guy, is looking to crack down on the Soviet Union and kick them while they're down. Now, the Soviet Union under Leonid Brezhnev had not done so well, and when he dies in 1982, there's now kind of a vacuum of stability in the Soviet Union. And the question is, who's going to right the ship? You know, the ship is already leeward and sinking in Russia. You know, it's things are a mess. And Russia goes through a period where they're looking for a little bit more reform-minded leader who's still going to be a communist, but not as hard-line conservative, hardcore of a communist as the old-school dudes that had been in power for so long. So the guy that they ultimately end up settling on by about 1985 is a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev. And so you can look him up. Gorbachev is how you pronounce his or spell his last name, Gorbachev. And Mikhail Gorbachev is still a communist. He's still advocating for communism in Russia, but he's advocating for new policies that are going to hopefully turn the ship around in Russia and kind of rectify a lot of these lingering economic problems that Russia had for so many years by this point. So he institutes a couple of new policies. One of them is going to be glasnost, 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 I think it's either glasnost, it's glasnost, glasnost, I think is how it's pronounced. And glasnost was about openness. Okay, so what they're trying to do is open things up, open the economy up a little bit, make Russia slightly less secretive. Also, remember, Russia had control still at this point in the 80s. I mean, going all the way back now to the end of World War II with Stalin, all the way up to the 80s. Russia still had control of basically all of Eastern Europe. And so part of the policy of openness was this glasnost policy, this policy of openness, was to try to open things up in Eastern Europe so that some of those nations could start running themselves a little bit more. And even though glasnost directly leads to these nations in Eastern Europe starting to single-handedly, one by one, break away from Soviet control, in some sense that's almost exactly what Russia needed to have happen, because running all of these puppet governments in Eastern Europe of nations that aren't Russia was tremendously burdensome to Russia's economy and their entire political infrastructure. So this policy of openness was allowing for, I hate to say the word democratization in Eastern Europe, because that's not really what the goal of the plan was. But the plan was to kind of allow for some of these nations to start running themselves so that Russia wouldn't have to be micromanaging all of these Eastern European countries like Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria and all these other places that Russia doesn't really want to have to administer politically. And so glasnost opens the door to, it's like peeking the door open, and then these other Eastern European nations kick the door open and start to break away from the Soviet Union and declare themselves sovereign nations no longer under Soviet rule. So that's glasnost. It kind of backfires. It doesn't work the way that he was hoping that it would, but the hope was to try to trim the fat, get rid of excess things that the Russian government didn't want to have to handle anymore. The other major, so glasnost, that's the one major, openness. The other major policy that Gorbachev advocates for is something called perestroika. Okay, perestroika, Perestroika. Perestroika. And what perestroika was kind of this economic revolution that he wanted to get going in Russia, an economic restructuring of the state of Russia, of the command economy of Russia. And what this would have involved is kind of in the same way that Vladimir Lenin, we talked about Vladimir Lenin before he died in 1924, he was trying to initiate something called the NEP, the New Economic Policy. And what the New Economic Policy was all about was during the Russian Civil War, right when the Russian Revolution happened, remember that they tried to institute something called war communism, which was a rapid communization of their entire economy, where the government went and basically just took over all these lands, took over all these businesses, and made everything run by the state. What this resulted in was massive economic chaos in Russia, and agricultural output fell, industrial output fell. War communism was recognized even by Vladimir Lenin, the communist revolutionary of Russia. He realized that this was a hugely bad maneuver economically for Russia. So what Vladimir Lenin had been trying to do towards the end of his reign was to initiate this thing called the New Economic Policy, which was supposed to take and reprivatize farms and other smaller businesses, so that the state wouldn't have such a huge economic burden to have to hold up in regulating the economy of all of these things that probably would do a lot better if they were just left to be running by themselves without state interference. And so this is kind of similar to what perestroika was trying to do. It was trying to take segments of the Russian economy, reprivatize them to a degree, restructure the whole economy to, once again, this time more in terms of economics rather than politics. With glasnost, it was more political. With perestroika, it's a little more economic. They're trying to trim the fat. They're trying to restructure the entire economy so that the communist government of Russia can take the reins of the economy again and get things under control. Once again, completely backfires on him, and it actually causes a major economic blow up in his face. So Gorbachev, oddly enough, even though he's this communist reformer guy, and he didn't want to see communism end in Russia, he ends up directly with his policies of trying to right the ship. He ends up single-handedly leading to a complete fragmenting of control in Russia. And what this turns into is that the hardliners, the ones who would have been more like Brezhnev or something, the hardliner communists are like, Gorbachev's killing the country, we have to do something. So the hardliners try to stage a coup against Mikhail Gorbachev while he is away on vacation for a weekend or something like that. And this hardliner coup ends up failing because another leader who was somewhat more reform-minded by the name of Boris Yeltsin famously stands in front of the tanks that were going to, march on the government and doesn't let the coup happen. And Gorbachev, and the entire structure of the Soviet Union, everything falls apart at that point, and the Soviet Union falls. And that happens in about 1991-ish. Now, up to that point, because of this glasnost policy starting in 1985, because of glasnost, as I said, there were a number of these Eastern European countries, Czechoslovakia and, Hungary and various other places where we start to see these revolutions take place, Poland, and other places like that are trying to break away from Soviet control. Well, one of the places that breaks away from Soviet control is East Germany, which had been under Soviet control going all the way back, again, to the end of World War II under Stalin. And when East Germany realizes the handwriting is on the wall, that the Soviet Union is failing, that's when we see the Berlin Wall torn down in 1989. So like a year and a half or two, maybe about 2 years before the actual crumbling of the Soviet Union, when they try and stage a coup against Mikhail Gorbachev, the Berlin Wall is torn down by East Germans in Berlin, who are, wanting to see the end of communist rule in East Germany. And it's at that point, once the Berlin Wall falls, once the Soviet Union falls, that finally, for the first time since the end of World War II, I was in first grade at the time, East and West Germany unite for the first time into a single German state. So when you look at a map of Europe today and you see a unified Germany, that has really only happened in my own lifetime. All throughout my mom's childhood into her adulthood, Germany was two places, West and East Germany. And so one of the first major events that I remember that we teach about in this class was my mom sat me down in front of the TV and said, you need to remember what's going on here. This is really important. I was about 5 or 6 years old at that point. And it was the East Germans tearing down the Berlin Wall. And so that's the story on that. And of course, there are other developments that end up happening as well in the Balkans. At that point, Yugoslavia very quickly starts to crumble after the fall of the Soviet Union, even though Yugoslavia had been a sovereign state and really they had been able magically to kind of, even though they were communist, they had kind of been able to navigate their own way of governing themselves outside of Soviet influence under the leader Tito, T-I-T-O, in Yugoslavia. But in the 90s, Yugoslavia goes through this fragmenting of their state, and it breaks into several different states that we now see on the European map today, such as Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, and various other places. So that's kind of what ends up happening with Yugoslavia after the fall of the Soviet Union as well. Czechoslovakia originally had been a singular state that was under Soviet rule for a very long time. Czechoslovakia was created after World War I. It had previously been the lands where Czechoslovakia were in an earlier time before World War I was actually ruled by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so Czechoslovakia had been a state. They had been supportive of democracy. And famously, remember, that was the story when we were talking about World War II, where Hitler took over Czechoslovakia and Britain did nothing. Well, in 1995, Czechoslovakia goes through something called the Velvet Divorce, I think is what they call it, where Czechoslovakia becomes two different states, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. But it was a peaceful, amicable split. There was no war that happened. They just realized, like, the Czechs are their own people, the Slovakians are their own people. Let's just create two separate governments. And so we don't see a Czechoslovakia anymore after 1995, I think it was, or 96. So anyhow, this pretty much brings us right up to the end of the Cold War. I didn't talk much about Reagan's presidency. Reagan during this whole time had been ramping things up. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union is drowning on its own. But Reagan famously made the speech about Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Is it Reagan that gets the wall torn down? Not really. The Soviet Union was already losing its grip on everything, and I would say that the policies of Mikhail Gorbachev are much more influential in the Berlin Wall coming down than Reagan's presidency was. But Reagan does restore people's faith in the government that the government is going to have a little bit more moral, I don't know what's the word that I'm looking for, moral credibility, I guess. There are other problems that happened under Reagan that he faced embarrassments about. There was a scandal in Nicaragua that happens in Central America. And there was early on in Reagan's presidency, at the tail end. So under Carter, who was, remember, president from 76 to 80, under Carter, there was this Iranian hostage scandal. And, this was resolved right when Reagan became president. The Iranian hostage crisis was something that really was a problem for Carter. Carter seemingly was not able to handle this Iranian hostage scandal very well. And so when Carter is voted out of office and Reagan takes over, Reagan was very quickly able to handle this Iranian hostage scandal, and the American hostages were released. But there was another thing that happened in Iran called the Iran-Contra scandal, where it was discovered that Americans were supplying troops to rebel forces in Iran to try to topple the government there, kind of similar to the Bay of Pigs under Kennedy. Again, just the Americans getting involved in governmental things secretly that they shouldn't be doing. And some of these made the news, but they weren't as huge of issues as the Cuba thing or the Vietnam War or something like that. And so Reagan was able to kind of keep his political livelihood afloat. Also, there was an attempt made against Reagan's life in his first term where he was shot. And actually, people don't realize just how darn close he was to dying. He had to have emergency surgery and stuff like that. They did capture the guy that attempted to assassinate President Reagan, but when Reagan emerges from the hospital after the assassination attempt, it ends up kind of being a boon to his re-election bid because he's seen as like a tough guy and was able to bounce back and was in good spirits about it. Also, too, he was a hardliner against the communists and other things and had restored some faith in the American government, and people liked Reagan a lot, generally speaking. So President Reagan gets re-elected in 1984. He serves until 1988. In Reagan's second term, he started to suffer from the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, which he ended up dying from in, I think, about 2004 or 5. And so it was a long battle for President Reagan, who struggled with Alzheimer's, which is one of the cruelest illnesses. If you know anyone who's suffering from Alzheimer's, it's just so harsh and so cruel of an illness, and it's very slow and very progressively degenerative. And so likely, by the end, of course, he wouldn't have even remembered being president. Probably wouldn't have even been able to remember who his loved ones were. It's just a horrible illness, but he lived a very, very long time with it. And so that kind of sums up the Reagan presidency for you. And Reagan, after his second term, he is replaced by another Republican president by the name of George H.W. Bush. This is George Bush Sr., who was a one-term president from 1988 until 1992, when he was replaced by Bill Clinton. So that kind of brings you up here through the end of the Cold War, and that is where I'm going to leave our lecture off for today. I am going to put up some sort of assignment. I still have to make it right now, but I'm going to put some sort of assignment up on Schoology for you guys to be able to complete, and I'll make it due for Friday, since the next online lecture will likely be tomorrow. And so it'll give you a little bit more time to get it done. But I just want to say thank you so much for those of you that tuned in today and listened to me speak about the end of the Cold War in Vietnam. And we will pick it up here next time. All right, folks, have a good one.